Welcome to this episode of the Think Wildlife podcast. Today, I speak to Krista Wright, who is the Executive Director of Polar Bear International. This is one of the leading organizations working towards the conservation of polar bears in the Arctic. Tune in to listen more and don't forget to share and subscribe to the podcast after listening to the episode. Welcome, Krista, to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on today.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
What got you interested in working with polar bears?
Well, it wasn't really specifically polar bears. I've always had a passion about the natural world and conservation. And so my drive was always to be working in that area of work, and also in my own life, spending a lot of time outdoors, enjoying nature and all the natural wonders of the world. And polar bears just became part of that. And I feel super fortunate, but it really came through my just greater love of conservation and specifically connecting kids. My previous background was working in environmental ed and outdoor education, where I spent over 20 years working with kids in the out of doors and working with educators to get them more passionate about science education. And that's really what led eventually to the polar bears.
What was the idea behind Polar Bears International and what is your long-term vision with the organization?
Well, the organization was started in 1992. And so, of course, I wasn't part of the organization at its inception, but it was really a group of polar bear enthusiasts who enjoyed getting out and seeing polar bears in the wild. And specifically, Dan Gervich was one of those enthusiasts. He founded Polar Bears Alive. So in its origination, it was called Polar Bears Alive. And this group of people would gather every fall during the key polar bear migration and enjoy being in the subarctic and taking pictures of polar bears. And since then, Polar Bears International has really emerged as a recognized leader in polar bear conservation. That's specifically guided by scientists who study polar bears and understand their ecology and their habitat and their threats. And so at first and foremost, Polar Bears International has become a science based organization that also does a lot of education outreach. And my specific goals, or the long-term vision for the organization, is really wrapped up in our mission, and that is to conserve polar bears and the sea ice they depend on, and specifically for future generations to still have polar bears roaming out on the Arctic sea ice.
What is the current conservation status of polar bears and where are they found?
Well, the conservation status of polar bears is listed as vulnerable under the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, also known as the IUCN, and they are listed as vulnerable. In other places across the globe, that listing could be higher. For instance, in the United States, polar bears are listed on the Endangered Species Act as threatened. Polar bears definitely face significant threats due to climate change, and that's specifically tied to the loss of their sea ice habitat, which is critical to preserving if we want to have polar bears into the future. And specifically, polar bears do live in the circumpolar Arctic. That often gets confused. Sometimes people think polar bears live in Antarctica as well. And we see that misrepresentation through media and other things, but polar bears do only live in the Arctic, and they live in the ice-covered regions, ideally, where they're out on the sea ice hunting for seals. And their key habitats 2/3 of the world's polar bears live in Canada. And then we also have polar bears distributed throughout Alaska, northern Alaska, Russia, Norway, and the island of Svalbard and Greenland.
What is the ecological importance of polar bears?
Well, polar bears play a crucial role in the Arctic ecosystem. They are top predators. They are actually considered apex predators in the Arctic food chain. And they particularly hunt on ring seals and other seal prey species. And, they're part of keeping that that population healthy as well. They're also considered indicator species because they're living at the top of the food chain and are often considered, the canary in the coal mine for other Arctic species that are, below, living lower on the food chain. And they are, highly adaptive to be living in the Arctic ecosystem. And really living out on the sea ice. That's where they do the primary part of their, things that sustain them, such as hunting seals, which I've mentioned is their primary prey resource. They also use the sea ice for mating and also for denning. So this habitat is critical. And, over the past too, this isn't so much ecological, but, they've always had a huge cultural significance for the Arctic and definitely are revered by indigenous northern people.
How do polar bears adapt to the harsh Arctic environment?
Well, this is one of the coolest things about polar bears. I mean, they really are built for the cold and are uniquely adapted to survive the harsh Arctic environment. And they do that through a handful of adaptations. First, they have a lot of insulation through their thick layers of fat that it's beneath their fur. And this insulates them against the cold. They also have really dense fur, as well as a second coat of like water resistant fur that really keeps them dry. And especially when they're, swimming in icy waters, they dry off quickly and stay dry. And then they have these really big, large paws. I mean, imagine their paws are the size of a large dinner plate. And they're extremely powerful with claws that are really sharp and good for helping them catch seals. They also have little suction cups on their paws that help them travel across the icy surfaces. And then their paws are also really powerful when they're swimming. And they can also be excellent swimmers. This is, depending, of course, on the conditions, but they are strong swimmers and they're capable of covering long distances in the water. And they use their front paws to paddle and their hind legs to steer. And then lastly, this is probably their most adept sense for sure, is their sense of smell. I mean, they have this really keen sense of smell that helps them to detect their prey source from great distances, as well as just using their sense of smell for warning them about danger, other polar bears in the area, other things that they have to be concerned by. It is definitely their most keen sense. And then, they just are uniquely geared to eating like this high, rich fat content, which you also find in the Arctic ecosystem through mostly seals. Like I mentioned before, they eat ring seals. They can eat other seals such as bearded seals and even the occasional, whale, but they have the adaptation to process this really high fat diet. And that also helps them be big, fat, and and in turn, that helps them stay warm and living out on the sea ice for long periods of time.
So you mentioned the threat of climate change to the polar bears. One of the papers which the Polar Bear International was involved with is basically studied how polar bear populations would fare under different climate change scenarios. Could you just elaborate a bit on this research?
Yes, so Dr. Stephen Amstrup, who is our chief scientist in emeritus, he led this research. And really what it's looking at is where we will have polar bears persisting in the Arctic under different scenarios. And specifically, looks at the idea of no action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, moderate action, and then swift, bold action. So if we continue business as usual, at the end of this century, we would likely lose most polar bears due to a loss of Arctic sea ice habitat. Whereas if we have moderate reductions, and that's really a little below the Paris Agreement targets, we would have polar bears persist in some of their subregions, but really the long term still is not ideal for polar bears. Versus if we take swift and bold action and really keep increase of global climate temperatures below that 2%, 2 degrees increase, that polar bears will likely persist along most of their current ranges. And that the messaging behind this is that really, if we act, it is not too late to protect polar bears and to see polar bears persevering into the future, versus if we continue on our current trajectory, ultimately this is not good for polar bears, and we are likely to lose most of the world's polar bears.
How severe is the issue of human polar bear conflict, and what are the driving factors of this conflict?
Well, specifically as the Arctic warms, like we've been talking about, we lose sea ice. And the time between in which the sea ice breaks up and then forms again is getting longer and longer. And that's forcing more polar bears to spend more time on land. And specifically in places where they could, interact with more people. So this has led to a uptick of polar bear and human encounters. And, unfortunately, sometimes these encounters have not very good results for humans. And so this is equally as important, if maybe not more important, of protecting humans and communities, and looking at places where we can reduce the negative interaction, and really look at opportunities where we can improve this coexistence, where we have humans living on land and there are periods of time where there could be polar bears. So it is not the greatest threat to polar bears. Climate change is the greatest threat to polar bears. And there are lots of examples of communities living and coexisting effectively with polar bears. But it is something, worth our attention. And clearly with the communities that live with polar bears, looking at ways that we can improve the coexistence efforts.
On that note, could you talk about how Polar Bear International is fostering human bear coexistence?
Well, first and foremost, it's really about working with and alongside the communities that live with polar bears, because it is their home, it is their community, and they have a lot of really great insight and ideas on how they can improve coexistence. So that is one area in which we've worked in, is working directly with local communities and determining what their concerns are, what their ideas are, and how we can, support those. And one of our long-term goals is really looking at those communities and how we can make them, kind of polar bear safe communities. And through those efforts with the local communities in which we're working with, we've been using radar to detect polar bears coming into communities. So as an early detection system, if a polar bear is entering into a community, can there be some sort of warning that alerts a conservation officer or a volunteer patrol, or, just the community at large, that there might be a polar bear in and around their community? We've also looked at waste management with communities and looking at how we can improve and reduce attractants that might be appealing to polar bears, drawing them into places that they really shouldn't be. And so we've done waste management audits. We've worked with a community in northern Canada called Churchill, Manitoba, where we have worked with the town to put in better bear-proof garbage cans. And we've also done just a lot of outreach, anywhere from creating coloring books that can be used locally to get kids more aware about safety issues around living in close proximity to polar bears. And we've done some really great educational outreach as far as like working with people that might be visiting communities where there are polar bears. And we've done this through safety videos and signage and working directly with the communities on how we can improve disseminating safety information.
How does pollution affect polar bears?
Well, pollution definitely can be, have very negative effects for polar bears, because you have polar bears at the top of the food chain. And then you also have currents in the Arctic where there's a bioaccumulation of toxins that don't actually happen in the Arctic, but end up in the Arctic due to ocean currents. Pollution can be a concern for polar bears. You can also look at just plastic pollution and other debris from the ocean that ends up living in, ending up being in the habitat of polar bears, where they're ingesting plastics or absorbing, chemicals that end up in the marine ecosystem. Oil and gas can also be a concern. If there's an oil spill in the high Arctic, the impact on the marine ecosystem and specifically for polar bears would not be favorable, or for their prey resources. And so definitely it's something to be concerned about with polar bears. But again, it's not the main threat impacting polar bears. It really is, the Arctic sea ice declining.
What exactly is indigenous knowledge, and what role does it play for polar bear conservation?
Well, indigenous knowledge is taking, hundreds, if not thousands of years of knowledge and experience, and taking that knowledge and implementing it into, the sphere of which we know. And so for polar bears specifically, indigenous people have been living amongst polar bears for thousands of years, and they have a lot of specific knowledge that from anywhere from where polar bears, kind of their adaptations or areas that they end up typically, or how to stay safe around polar bears. And all of that knowledge ideally is incorporated into our current knowledge. And so that is very important as it relates to polar bear conservation, because the people directly living with polar bears, although they're not directly responsible for the threats facing polar bears, they are the ones living most closely to them. And so implementing this knowledge into management and into information that's shared more broadly about polar bears is critical and really important in all of our communications and outreach.
Earlier, you mentioned about the polar bear tracker. What are some of the other tech innovations which Polar Bear International is working upon for conservation of the polar bears?
Yeah, so we've been really lucky to have an opportunity to look at new ways of doing things, and tech has played a big role in, looking at ways where we can, innovate or progress how things have previously been done. So one of the specific things that we've worked on, well, I mentioned the radar detection for early detection of polar bears entering in, communities or work camps. So that's one tech innovation. But we've also worked at developing a tag. For instance, when polar bears are tracked, they generally have been tracked through the use of satellite collars. And currently, you can only put the satellite collars on female polar bears. Male polar bears, their necks are too long and heads too narrow. They're very cone-shaped, and the collars slide off. And so we've been looking at new ways where we could track polar bears that are possibly track different bears, not just female bears. So you could track male bears and even younger bears. And also that maybe tracking them different would be less invasive. So we've been working on developing what we call a burr on fur, where the tracking device is actually attached to the fur of the polar bear. So that's another example where we've used tech to really innovate and progress how polar bear research is done.
What are some of the research which Polar Bear International is involved with?
Well, we've had long-term projects where we've been studying maternal denning. And specifically, we've been most recently doing this work in Norway. Previously, we had conducted a similar study in Alaska. And in that project, we are setting up remote cameras. Again, another tech innovation. We're setting up remote cameras on polar bear dens. So it's non-invasive. We're setting the cameras up outside of the dens before the polar bear mothers have emerged with their cubs. And the goal of that project is to really look at the time in which the bears are emerging, the health of the female and the cubs, and what their behavior is when they are outside the den and still at the den. And then also looking at the time in which before they come out of the den to the time they actually leave to go back out on the sea ice. So that is one project. We are also doing some really new types of projects using polar bear genetics. That's a project that we're supporting in partnership with the Canadian government, and also working with universities and looking at what we can learn from polar bear genetics.
What else is Polar Bear International doing for the conservation of polar bears?
One of the most recent things was kind of twofold, was taking and using research and how it might impact policy. So the paper that we spoke about earlier from Dr. Stephen Amstrup, we were taking some of the most recent research that he did, specifically looking at, greenhouse gas emissions and understanding their impact on Arctic sea ice, and using that information to impact policy around, action around climate. So on the policy front of things, Polar Bears International has been attending international conferences with other like-minded people that are also focused on similar issues. We've most recently attended the Arctic Circle, where we were working with other people on Arctic-related issues. And of course, we have formally participated in COP. This year, we did not specifically go to COP and instead sent youth and Indigenous representation from the Arctic to participate in those meetings. And then in this upcoming year, we'll be doing a big Get Out to Vote campaign, specifically voting for the climate. So when we're electing officials, climate should be a big part of their platform, and, really looking at how we can pick up the pace on government leadership as it relates to climate policy.
How can individuals contribute to Polar Bear International and polar bear conservation as a whole?
Well, there are several different things that individuals can do, no matter where you live. So one is, I think, to get educated and to become informed. So really understanding not so much specifically about polar bears, but really climate change and, the impacts on our global community. And then you can use that information and knowledge to vote for elected officials that are going to really take action on climate, because it's not just good for polar bears, it's good for all people and all living things on the planet. You can also vote with your dollar. So how you spend your money is really important. And so looking towards companies that have good sustainability practices in place and that are also looking at ways that their business and the leadership that they have within their business can be, looking at ways that they can reduce, greenhouse gas emissions. And then lastly is really talking about it. I mean, I think one of the most important things that we've seen is even over the last, decade, is there are more people across the globe that are in agreement that climate change is happening and that there is something that humans can do about it. And I think that's come from, the last decade of battling some of the misinformation, but also through having conversations with one another and finding areas in which we can agree on. So that's really helpful. And then also you can just visit our website. We'd love for you to come visit our website. It's www.polarbearsinternational.org. And you can directly support our work by visiting our website, or just come to our website and get more informed and not only learn about polar bears, but learn how you can directly help in our conservation efforts.
What have been some of the most pressing challenges you have faced, not only in your personal conservation career, but also at Polar Bear International?
I think one of the biggest is what we were talking about in the previous question around, what can people do to conserve polar bears? the one of the most pressing challenges I've seen in the past decade was really the denial of what was happening. But the good news is that's changed, and it has even changed during my time working at Polar Bears International, where those conversations are less and less, and there are more conversations around the areas that we agree, and specifically the areas in which we need to take action on. And so, my most pressing challenge is actually, it's been great to be at Polar Bears International for this period of time where I can actually see that challenge dissipate and improve, which is exciting. And it's, I think it's not happening fast enough, but it is happening.
What have been some of your most memorable moments from your conservation career?
Well, definitely anytime I get to visit the Arctic or be in the Arctic, and specifically, during the winter, during when it's cold, during when there's sea ice there, or when you get to be with someone where they're seeing their first polar bear in the wild. I mean, it never gets old. It never gets boring. It's always exciting. And I think it always fills, kind of fills the cup on, why this is important, why, that I've spent the last decade dedicating my life to working with polar bears, and my colleagues too. I think it really makes us realize all that's at stake. It isn't just polar bears, it is really all living things, and this includes humans as well. And it never gets, that part of it never gets old. But it is important to remain, kind of optimistic, and to kind of believing that we can do this.
That was a final question I had for you today for this interview. Thank you so much for your time, and we hope you can enjoy Polar Bear Day this year.
Yes, we hope you get to as well.